The sky above Mars was no longer red, it was black, filled with the burning wrecks of ships and the glow of explosions that looked like dying stars. The alien armada had come without mercy. Their ships were huge and cold, moving through the upper atmosphere like a wall of steel and light. Every few seconds, a new blast shook the planet, and pieces of human cities vanished in fire. Captain Ryan Cole stood inside an underground bunker beneath the dunes, staring at the monitor that showed the alien fleet overhead. The air inside the room was thick with dust and smoke from power failures. The ground shook again and bits of sand fell from the ceiling. But Ryan didn't move. He had seen too much to flinch now. He was tired. His armor was scratched and dented, his face marked with ash, but his eyes still carried that sharp focus only soldiers got after too many close calls. On the screens before him, the enemy's flagship appeared, a massive dark shape with glowing rings along its sides. He knew what that meant. Those rings were charging up. His radio cracked with static. Then a familiar voice broke through, calm and steady even under pressure. "Ryan," said Lieutenant Grace Miller from a bunker a few miles away. "They're charging the Omega Array. This is it." He didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed on the burning horizon. He could see the faint light growing in the clouds, where the alien weapon gathered its power. The Omega Array, the same weapon that had destroyed the Jupiter colonies in one blast. He took a slow breath, then spoke, his voice low but clear. "Then let's make it count." Grace didn't ask what he meant. She knew him too well. For 2 years they had fought side by side, surviving battles that should have killed them both. She knew that tone, the one Ryan used right before doing something reckless, something that mattered. Another explosion shook the bunker. The lights flickered. A soldier ran past carrying a damaged comms panel, shouting about power loss, but Ryan didn't hear him. His mind was somewhere else, with the people above, the families who hadn't made it to the shelters, the engineers still trying to keep the defense grid alive. He knew the odds. They weren't going to win today. Not in the usual sense. But humans never really needed to win to fight. They just needed one last chance to prove they wouldn't kneel. Ryan straightened, checked the power gauge on his wrist console, and looked once more at the alien flagship. A thin smile crossed his face, not of joy but of defiance. If this was the end, he was going to make sure the aliens remembered the name humanity for as long as the stars burned. The light in the sky grew so bright it painted the red Martian dunes in white. Even from miles underground, soldiers covered their eyes as the monitors flared. The Omega Array was waking, a weapon said to carry the heat of 1,000 suns. Up above, Captain Ryan Cole stood on the surface, alone among the ruins. The wind howled around him, throwing red dust into the air. His armor was broken, scratched, and half melted in places. Every breath felt heavy, but he didn't step back. He looked at the alien fleet far above, so high it was just a line of shining dots in the black sky. The main ship, the one with the Omega Array, glowed like a second sun. Inside the alien command ship, their commander gave the order. No anger, no mercy. Just a cold, perfect voice saying one word: fire. Back on the surface, Ryan heard the comm in his ear crackle. "Ryan, we can't stop that thing," said Lieutenant Grace Miller, her voice shaking for the first time since the war began. "If it fires, everything on this planet is gone." Ryan closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear her breathing, fast and uneven. Grace had always been steady under pressure, but this time even she sounded afraid. He opened his eyes and looked at the sky again. The light from the array was growing larger, filling the clouds with burning white. He knew it wasn't fear that froze people in moments like this, it was the feeling of watching something too big, too powerful to fight. Still he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small curve at the corner of his lips, but it was real. It carried a message not just for the aliens but for anyone still listening. "They think that's our end," he said quietly. "They have no idea what's waiting." His voice came through the comms, calm and sure. Grace didn't answer right away. She was staring at the same light from deep underground, her hands frozen above the control board. When she finally spoke, her tone had changed. "What did you do, Ryan?" He didn't reply. Ryan walked forward slowly, each step crunching through the dust. Around him were the remains of a once busy colony, homes, vehicles, the skeletons of machines left behind in the panic. He looked at them, remembering the people who had lived here, laughed here, built dreams under the Martian sun. The Omega Array was about to erase all of it, every trace of human life on this planet. But Ryan knew something the aliens didn't. Something built deep into Mars itself, a plan older than this war, hidden under layers of rock and silence. He took a deep breath and looked at the glowing sky once more. The light of the Omega Array reflected in his visor, and for a brief moment, it looked like fire dancing in his eyes. And still he smiled. Far below the Martian surface, in tunnels carved long before the war began, the old machine started to wake. The hum of deep power lines returned, and the walls of forgotten chambers flickered with dim blue light. These systems were built in the early days of colonization, when humans still dreamed of turning Mars into a second Earth. No one had seen them active in over 100 years. Lieutenant Grace Miller stood in front of a control panel covered in dust. Her hands shook slightly as she wiped it clean, revealing the faded words, "Terraform Command, Restricted Access." The screens were old, their corners cracked, but they still worked. Her headset crackled again. "Grace," Ryan's voice came through, calm but strained. "It's time." She stared at the blinking cursor waiting for a command. She knew what he meant. The last protocol, one that even most officers didn't believe was real. It wasn't meant to be used in war. It was meant for rebirth. But desperate times had twisted it into something else. Grace took a slow breath and typed in the words, "ASHFL." The system paused as if thinking. Then a deep rumble echoed through the underground base. The power readings jumped. The lights flickered red, then white. Somewhere far below, something massive came to life. Old reactors buried under mountains of rock started to spin, their cores glowing with energy. They weren't bombs. They were quantum forges, machines that could rebuild soil, air, even oceans. They were humanity's greatest tools for creation. Now they had been rewritten to protect. Grace could feel the vibration under her feet growing stronger. The ceiling dust fell in small waves. The other soldiers in the bunker looked at her with fear and confusion. "What did you just do?" one asked. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the screen. Above the surface, the Omega Array finally fired. A column of light brighter than the sun tore through the sky and hit Mars. The world seemed to stop. For a second, Grace expected everything to end, for the ground to vanish and the air to burn. But instead the light bent. It didn't explode outward. It folded in, twisting like it was being swallowed. The forges were working. Deep inside the planet, the machines absorbed the impossible energy, breaking it apart, storing it, turning it into something else. From orbit, the alien fleet watched in confusion. Their sensors showed the impossible, the beam of the Omega Array disappearing into the planet, not destroying it but feeding it. Mars began to change color. The red turned to a glowing crimson-white, bright enough to be seen from space. The entire planet pulsed softly, like a living thing taking its first breath. Grace stared at the rising energy readings, her voice barely a whisper. It worked. And far above, Ryan looked up at the glowing sky, and knew the real battle had just begun. For a brief moment, the alien fleet believed they had won. From their command ships, they watched the surface of Mars glow brighter than any sun, believing the human world had finally fallen. Their voices filled the comm channels in cold celebration, victory, after years of stubborn resistance. But the celebration didn't last. Moments later, the readings on their scanners began to shift. The energy from the Omega Array wasn't fading. It was growing, rising higher and higher, bouncing back from the surface like a mirror reflecting a star. The alien engineers shouted over one another, confused, trying to explain what was happening. And then their ships began to break apart. At first it was small, a flicker across their shields, a ripple in their engines. Then the light around them twisted, folding space itself. The metal of their ships stretched and cracked like glass in slow motion. The very energy they had fired was coming back, not weakened but magnified 1,000 times. Down on the Martian surface, Captain Ryan Cole stood watching the sky. The air shimmered with heat, glowing white and red. He could see the alien ships burning silently in the thin atmosphere. The scene looked almost peaceful, but he knew what it meant. Humanity's counterstrike had begun. He pressed a button on his wrist console, opening every remaining human channel across Mars and the fleet fragments still alive in orbit. His voice came through, clear and calm, cutting through the static. "They wanted extinction," Ryan said. "Let's give them a demonstration." The soldiers who heard his words felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Even as the sky burned, they straightened, watching in awe as the impossible unfolded above them. The wave began, silent, smooth and unstoppable. It moved faster than light, spreading outward from Mars like a heartbeat across the stars. Every bit of energy the Omega Array had unleashed was now returning to its source, not as destruction but as pure retaliation. In seconds, the alien ships turned into clouds of light, fading without sound. Their signals vanished. Their massive command ship, the same one that had fired the weapon, melted into the void, leaving only a fading shimmer where it once was. The scanners in the human bunkers showed nothing but empty space. The alien fleet, hundreds of ships strong, was gone. Completely erased. Grace stared at the screens, her mouth slightly open. "Ryan," she whispered. They're all gone." Outside, the glow began to fade. Mars, still alive and pulsing faintly, stood untouched among the stars. Ryan looked up at the quiet sky. For the first time in years, there were no enemy signals, no incoming fire, no alarms. Just silence. He took a slow breath and said softly, "They should have known better than to test what humanity becomes when it has nothing left to lose." The turning point had come, and it belonged to humans. The battlefield was silent. The kind of silence that feels alive, heavy, deep, almost sacred. The wind had stopped. The red dust of Mars settled slowly over a land that had been torn apart only hours ago. The fires were gone. The sky, once filled with flashes and explosions, now stretched wide and calm. Lieutenant Grace Miller pushed open the heavy hatch of the bunker. The hinges groaned as she climbed out into the open air. The heat had faded, but the ground still shimmered faintly. What had once been rough sand was now smooth, hardened glass, glowing gently in the sunlight. Her boots crunched as she walked forward. The quiet was strange, almost frightening. For years she had lived with the sound of alarms, weapons, and screams in her ears. Now there was nothing. Only the faint hum of the wind returning to life. In the distance she saw him, Captain Ryan Cole, standing alone on a small rise. His armor was scarred and half melted, the paint burned off by heat. But he was alive. He stood tall, looking up at the sky that had once rained destruction upon them. Grace called out softly, "Ryan?" He didn't turn right away. He just kept looking upward, eyes following the slow drift of light where the alien ships had once been. When she reached him, she saw that faint, familiar smile on his face. The same one he'd worn before the Omega array had fired. "They fired their ultimate weapon," he said quietly, almost to himself. "And all they did was charge ours." Grace stood beside him, trying to take in what had happened. The planet had survived. Against all odds, humanity had turned its enemy's greatest weapon into its own shield, and more than that, into a lesson. The Martian horizon glowed softly, the color of dawn. For the first time in years it looked peaceful, not like a battlefield but like the start of something new. Grace glanced at Ryan. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "Not them. Maybe others someday. But they'll remember this." He looked at the ground beneath their feet. Glass melted into strange, smooth shapes by the sheer power of what had happened. "They'll remember that humans don't break easy. That we fight different." There was pride in his voice but also weariness. They had won, yes, but the cost was written in every scar, every piece of burned ground. Years later, long after the dust had settled and Mars had begun to heal, distant civilizations would whisper about the event. In alien records scattered across the stars, one human phrase was preserved, simple, mysterious, and impossible to forget. Read. "Don't corner a species that learned to smile in the dark." And in that single line they understood the truth, that humans were not powerful because of their weapons, but because of their will. Because even in the face of the impossible, they smiled.